these stories are true. Names, locations, investigations, and documented events are based on real cases reported by law enforcement journalists at FBI investigations. Robert Ben Rhodes looked ordinary. That is what almost every witness said afterward. He was tall, quiet, broad-shouldered, with a heavy trucker beard, and the exhausted look common among long-haul drivers who spend weeks moving across America's highways. He drove refrigerated freight across state lines and slept in truck stops from Texas to Illinois to Arizona. Other truckers passed him every night without remembering his face. That was part of why he survived so long. In the 1980s and early 1990s, America's interstate system became a hunting ground for killers who understood something terrifying about long-distance trucking. If you moved constantly, bodies and disappearances stopped connecting cleanly. A woman could vanish in one state and appear dead in another. Local police departments rarely communicated well back then. Missing persons files sat untouched for years. Prostitutes, hitchhikers, and runaway teenagers disappeared so often near highways that many cases barely made newspapers. Rhodes understood that perfectly. He modified the cab of his truck into something investigators later described as a mobile torture chamber. Hidden inside were chains fixed to walls, handcuffs, whips, restraints, and Polaroid photographs of terrified women. Some were alive in the pictures. Some were already dead. The inside of the sleeper compartment looked less like a truck and more like a sealed room designed specifically for human suffering. One of the most horrifying cases connected to him involved a young couple named Ricky Lee Jones and Regina K. Walters. They were teenagers. They had been traveling through Texas in 1990 after leaving home together. Broke, exhausted, drifting from place to place. Witnesses later said they had been hitchhiking along highways when Rhodes picked them up. Nobody knows exactly what happened inside the truck during those first hours, but investigators believe Rhodes separated them quickly. Ricky Jones was found first. His body was discovered in Mississippi, naked and decomposing in a wooded area near a highway. He had been strangled. There was no sign of Regina. For weeks, she was simply gone. Then a farmer in Illinois entered an abandoned barn near his property and discovered one of the most disturbing murder scenes investigators had seen in years. Regina Walters was there. She was only 14 years old. What made the scene infamous was not just the murder itself. It was the photographs. Before killing her, Rhodes forced Regina into a black dress and high heels. He cut her hair short. Then he photographed her inside the barn while she tried to back away from him in absolute terror. In the images, she looks frozen between panic and disbelief, pressed against wooden walls while staring directly at the camera. Those photographs later became some of the most chilling crime scene images associated with any highway serial killer case. The expression on her face disturbed veteran investigators for decades afterward, because it looked like she understood exactly what was about to happen. Rhodes was eventually stopped almost by accident. An Arizona state trooper noticed his truck parked in an area where it should not have been. When the officer approached, he found a naked and terrified woman chained inside the sleeper compartment. Rhodes had been torturing her for days. The timing saved her life by minutes or hours. Investigators later realized that if the officer had driven past without stopping, she almost certainly would have disappeared forever like many others. The deeper investigators dug, the worse things became. Photographs found in the truck showed unidentified women bound and abused. Some have never been identified even today. The FBI later connected hundreds of highway murders and disappearances to patterns involving long-haul trucking routes, truck stops, and interstate corridors. Many remain unsolved. Former FBI officials later admitted something deeply unsettling. There may have been many killers like him. Not one. Many. Truckers who crossed multiple jurisdictions. Men who understood isolated rest stops, vulnerable runaways, prostitutes near truck plazas, and the fact that highways create anonymity. A man could kill in one state at night and be 3 states away by morning. Before national databases improved, those murders often looked unrelated. That realization eventually led to the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative. The initiative connected clusters of murdered women found near interstates across America. Officials eventually identified hundreds of linked cases and hundreds of suspects. many associated with long-haul trucking routes. But what makes Rhodes especially horrifying is how invisible he was while doing it. Truck stop workers remembered him as quiet. Other drivers remembered him as normal. Nobody walking past his truck at 2 in the morning would have guessed a chained woman might be screaming inside the sleeper compartment, while diesel engines idled all around her. That is the part many people misunderstand about true trucking horror. It usually does not happen on empty roads. It happens surrounded by ordinary life. Bright truck stop lights, coffee machines, CB radio chatter, drivers cleaning windshields, families buying gas. Meanwhile, 50 feet away, somebody could already be dead inside a locked cab. Even after Rhodes was convicted, investigators believed the confirmed murders represented only a fraction of his real victim count. Some estimates linked him to dozens of disappearances across multiple states over many years. And that is what keeps the case alive in trucking communities and FBI discussions even now. Not just the brutality, the scale. Because the interstate system is enormous. Millions of people move through it constantly. Thousands of truck stops operate all night, every night. And somewhere in all that movement, Robert Ben Rhodes managed to turn America's highways into a hunting ground for years before anyone truly understood what they were looking at. In the early 2000s, truck drivers moving cargo through northern Mexico began to disappear along certain highway corridors, connect to cartel territory near Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, and stretches of Federal Highway 85. At first, the disappearances looked ordinary by border region standards. Hijackings, stolen freight, missing drivers, insurance losses, another dangerous route. But truckers started talking to each other at fuel stops, warehouses, and customs lines, and a pattern emerged that terrified even experienced drivers. Some trucks were being found abandoned with cargo untouched, engines still running, driver doors open, coffee still warm inside the cab, but no driver, no blood, no struggle, nothing. One of the most documented and disturbing cases tied to cartel-controlled highways involved a Mexican truck driver named Miguel Ramirez, whose testimony later circulated among freight companies operating near the border. Portions of his account were repeated in trucking forums, regional news interviews, and internal driver warnings shared privately between logistics companies operating in Tamaulipas during the height of cartel violence in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Ramirez had been hauling electronics southbound during a period when Los Zetas controlled large sections of territory along major trucking corridors. Los Zetas were different from older cartels. Many of their early members came from military backgrounds and used methods designed around psychological terror. Entire roads effectively became controlled zones after dark. Truckers knew which gas stations were safe, which stretches required convoy driving, and which highways people avoided entirely after sunset. ian.wikipedia.org. Please open your app to see this link. Miguel reportedly left Monterrey late to make a delivery deadline despite warnings from other drivers. That was the first mistake. Experienced truckers in the area had an unofficial rule back then. If locals told you not to drive after dark, you listened. Freight delays mattered less than disappearing. Around midnight, Miguel noticed something strange on the CB radio. Silence. Normally there was always chatter, drivers insulting each other, border updates, police locations, warnings about checkpoints, even static was common. But on that stretch near San Fernando, multiple channels went almost completely dead at once. Then he passed the first truck. It sat angled halfway off the road with headlights on. Driver door open, nobody inside. He slowed instinctively, expecting a robbery victim or mechanical problem. But another truck appeared a mile later in almost identical condition. Lights on, door open, empty, then a third. According to Miguel's later account, this was the moment he realized something was deeply wrong. Not random crime, coordination. He tried radioing for response. Nothing. Then his CB suddenly activated with heavy static, followed by a calm male voice saying, "Keep driving if you want to live." Miguel thought at first it was another trucker warning him. Then the voice added, "They are checking the stopped vehicles." The transmission cut. He accelerated immediately. A few miles later, he saw headlights ahead, blocking part of the highway. Several black SUVs stood across lanes while armed men moved between vehicles with flashlights, Some wore tactical gear almost identical to military uniforms. Others wore plain black clothing with face coverings. Miguel later said the scene looked less like organized crime and more like a military checkpoint from a war zone. Truckers in that region had already learned something horrifying about cartel checkpoints by then. Fake roadblocks were common. Some groups dressed as federal police or soldiers. Drivers who stopped often vanished permanently. en.wikipedia.org. Please open your app to see this link. Miguel killed his headlights and slowed before reaching them. Then he saw the bodies. 3 men kneeling beside the road with their hands zip-tied behind their backs. One was still moving. An armed man kicked him over into the ditch casually, while another inspected the inside of a trailer nearby. Miguel realized the abandoned trucks earlier were not random. Drivers had seen the checkpoint ahead and fled their vehicles into the desert. Some had apparently been caught. The SUVs ahead suddenly turned headlights toward him. Miguel panicked and swerved off the highway onto rough dirt beside the road. His trailer nearly rolled. He later said he could hear gunfire immediately behind the cab as bullets hit metal somewhere near the refrigeration unit. But the terrifying part came next. The cartel vehicles did not chase him immediately. Instead, they turned their lights off completely. The desert became black. Miguel drove blind across uneven terrain beside the highway while trying not to flip the trailer. Behind him, no headlights followed, no gunfire, nothing. At first, he thought he escaped. Then he realized why they turned their lights off, so he could not see them pacing him. For nearly 20 minutes, he drove through darkness, hearing engines moving somewhere nearby beyond visible range. Sometimes close to the cab, sometimes farther away. He described the feeling later as being hunted by vehicles you could hear breathing but never see. Then the radio activated again. Not static this time, screaming, multiple people screaming at once, men begging for help, one voice yelling coordinates, then sudden silence. Miguel later learned that Los Zetas and similar groups often monitored trucking frequencies directly. Some survivors believe cartels intentionally used radio terror tactics to spread panic among drivers moving through controlled territory at night. Eventually, Miguel reached a military checkpoint near Ciudad Victoria. Real military. He reportedly broke down crying before he could even explain what happened. According to later interviews, soldiers initially thought he was exaggerating until another truck arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a driver covered in blood from shattered window glass. That second driver described seeing bodies hanging beneath an overpass farther north. The military eventually investigated sections of the highway. What they found became part of one of the most infamous cartel atrocities in Mexican history. Near San Fernando, authorities later uncovered mass graves tied to cartel killings. Many victims were migrants, bus passengers, travelers, and drivers intercepted along highways. Some were reportedly forced off vehicles at fake checkpoints. Others disappeared entirely during nighttime travel through cartel territory. en.wikipedia.org. Please open your app to see this link. Truckers began sharing survival rules privately after that. Never stop for unofficial checkpoints. Never drive certain roads alone after dark. Never trust vehicles mimicking police without verification. Never leave the highway unless locals tell you to. And most importantly, if multiple trucks appear abandoned with doors open, turn around immediately. But some stories became even stranger. Drivers operating through Tamaulipas during peak cartel violence described entire highways feeling cursed after midnight. Burned vehicles left untouched for days. Shoes scattered across roadsides with no bodies nearby. Convoys of black SUVs appearing without headlights, then vanishing into side roads. Empty buses sitting in darkness with luggage still inside overhead compartments. One trucker later described pulling into an isolated fuel station around 3 a.m. where every parked truck was empty. Engines running, lights on, no people anywhere. The station attendant reportedly told him quietly they heard there was a checkpoint ahead. Then the attendant locked the station doors and shut off all exterior lights. Nobody spoke for the next hour, because everyone waiting there understood the same thing. On certain highways in cartel territory, disappearing was not the scariest outcome. Sometimes people were taken alive. That fear became so widespread that many freight companies quietly changed logistics operations entirely. Convoy driving increased. Drivers avoided nighttime movement through specific regions. Some companies hired armed escorts despite legal complications. Others simply refused loads moving through certain corridors after dark. Even now, older Mexican truckers sometimes speak carefully about those years. Not dramatically, not like ghost stories, more like men discussing whether they survived. Because for a period of time, certain highways in northern Mexico effectively became hunting grounds controlled by armed groups who could stop traffic whenever they wanted. And what disturbed many drivers most was not the violence itself. It was how normal the roads looked while it happened. Gas stations still sold coffee, music still played from radios, freight still moved, families still drove vacations through some of those same highways during daylight. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the headlights, hidden behind hills or tree lines or fake checkpoints, entire groups of armed men waited for the next truck to slow down. On November 18, 2025, truck driver Wayne Yarian was driving near Garden Valley, Texas, about 80 miles east of Dallas, when he reported seeing something walking through a field, roughly 200 feet from the road. He was moving about 50 to 55 miles per hour, could not safely stop, and later reported the sighting to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. The report was treated as a Class A sighting, meaning the witness claimed a clear observation close enough that ordinary explanations were considered less likely by the investigators handling the report. It happened in daylight, which is part of what makes the account feel worse. Most people imagine creature sightings at night. They imagine a lonely highway, rain on the windshield, headlights cutting through fog, something pale standing just beyond the shoulder. That is easier to dismiss. Darkness can make anything into a monster. Wayne Yarian's sighting was different. He was not parked in the woods. He was not half asleep in a sleeper cab. He was not walking through a tree line with a flashlight in fear doing half the work. He was driving in broad daylight near Garden Valley, Texas, on a normal stretch of road with open land beside him. He had the elevated view of a truck driver, the kind of vantage point where a man gets used to reading the world quickly. Animals, broken down vehicles, debris, road workers, farm equipment, people walking where they should not be walking. That is why what he saw bothered him. At first, according to his account, it was only an object moving in the field. Then his brain corrected itself. It was walking, not loping like a dog, not moving like cattle, not crossing low to the ground like a hog. It was upright, dark brown, and moving with purpose toward a wooded area. It was not standing frozen beside the road. It was not staring at traffic. It was going somewhere. That detail matters. Many strangely because the thing is only seen for a second, standing still, half hidden, maybe a stump, maybe a shadow, maybe a man in dark clothes. But Yarian described motion, a walking gait, long arms hanging down near the knees, height around 6 to 7 feet, dark brown coloration, no apparent fear of the road noise around it. That last part is what would stay with the driver. Road noise changes animals. Deer bolt, dogs flinch, cattle lift their heads, birds scatter. Even people react when a truck passes near them at highway speed. The size, vibration, and sound of a truck are not subtle. But this thing kept moving. It did not panic. It did not run. It did not turn and vanish dramatically. It simply walked toward the woods. Yarian continued driving because stopping was not practical at that speed and on that road. He later told investigators that after processing what he had seen, and after speaking with his wife, they looked into the area and learned East Texas had a long history of similar reports. That is where the account becomes more unsettling. Garden Valley is not some random empty place with no folklore around it. East Texas has long been treated by Bigfoot researchers and local believers as one of the major sighting regions in the state. Reports have clustered around wooded and swampy areas, including places like Montgomery County, Liberty County, the Sam Houston National Forest region, and the broader pine forest country where roads cut through large private properties and thick timberland. The article notes that Jefferson, Texas has even branded itself around Bigfoot lore, and investigators could not fully inspect the land connected to Yarian's report because the sighting area involved private property. What the specific property reportedly around 900 acres and part of adjoining properties totaling around 2,800 acres. For a trucker, that is the nightmare version of a sighting. Not a monster in the road. Not something chasing the cab. Something off to the side. Something that knows the tree line is close. Something that appears for only a few seconds, long enough to be seen clearly, but not long enough for proof. Imagine the cab moving at 55 miles per hour, the engine noise steady, the road ahead normal, your hands on the wheel, a field opening to your right. You glance over because truckers are trained by repetition to notice movement. Something tall is crossing the land. Your first instinct is probably human, a person. Then the proportions are wrong. The arms are too long, the body is too dark, the stride is too clawed. You keep driving because a loaded truck does not stop like a car. You look in the mirror, but the angle is gone. You think about pulling over, but there is nowhere safe. By the time you could turn around, the thing would already be in the trees. So you keep going, and that might be the worst part. Nothing attacks you. Nothing proves itself. No one else in the cab confirms it. You are left alone with the image. A tall, dark brown figure, moving through an East Texas field in daylight, arms hanging low, walking with purpose, not reacting to the sound of the road. Later, when you tell your wife, it becomes real in a different way. She searches. She finds out the region has a reputation. She finds other reports, other witnesses, other wooded counties, other roads, other people who saw something, and had to keep living afterward with no clean explanation. Yarian's report was later described as credible by the organization that reviewed it, though the property access issue prevented deeper field investigation. That means the case sits in the worst possible category for anyone who wants certainty. Not proven, not easily dismissed, just reported clearly enough to remain uncomfortable. Yet for truckers, that kind of story spreads differently than ordinary ghost stories. Drivers understand false alarms. They understand fatigue. They understand how a bush can become a man for half a second. How headlights can warp distance. How sleep deprivation can make the edge of the road move. They also understand the opposite. They understand when something is seen cleanly. They understand when the brain does not invent the movement, but recognizes it. That is why a daylight creature sighting from a truck cab can feel more disturbing than a midnight haunting. There is no fog to blame, no darkness to hide behind, just a road, a field, a wall of woods, and a thing walking calmly toward cover before the driver can do anything except keep moving. In 1981, veteran truck driver Ken Moody was hauling a refrigerated load through the Scottish road system near the A75, a highway that truckers and locals had already started calling one of the most haunted roads in Britain. The route cuts through long stretches of isolated countryside between Dumfries and Gretna Green. At night, especially in winter, the highway becomes almost completely empty. No towns, no lights, only wet asphalt, rolling black hills, and fog thick enough to erase the horizon. Truckers hated driving it alone after midnight. Not because of accidents, because of what people kept seeing. Moody later described the night in interviews and statements that circulated among British trucking communities for years afterward. He had driven professionally long enough to understand road hypnosis, fatigue, and hallucinations. He was not a rookie. He knew how isolation affects the brain after hundreds of miles in darkness. That was exactly why the experience disturbed him so badly. He could not explain it away afterward. It was sometime after 2 a.m. Rain had been falling lightly for hours, enough to make the road reflective but not dangerous. His headlights stretched across wet pavement, while the truck engine droned steadily through the cab. He remembered there being almost no other vehicles around him for nearly 30 minutes. Then he saw people ahead, a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children walking directly in the middle of the highway. That alone made no sense. There were no nearby houses, no disabled vehicles, no service stations for miles. The children were holding hands. The adults wore pale clothing that reflected strangely in the headlights. Moody immediately slammed the brakes and swerved, convinced he was about to kill all 4 of them. But the truck passed through empty road. Nobody was there. No impact. No screams. Nothing. He stopped the truck hard on the shoulder and got out into the rain, thinking exhaustion had finally gotten to him. But according to Moody, the feeling outside the cab was even worse. The highway was silent except for rain hitting metal. No footsteps. No movement in the fields, yet he was absolutely convinced seconds earlier that there had been people standing directly in front of him. He climbed back into the cab, shaken badly enough that he considered stopping for the night. Then the CB radio activated. At first, only static, then another trucker's voice. "You saw them too?" Moody reportedly froze. The other driver was several miles behind him on the same road. Without Moody saying anything over the radio, the driver described exactly what he had just seen. A family walking across the highway that vanished when approached. The second trucker sounded terrified. He kept repeating that the children had looked directly into his windshield before disappearing. That incident became one of many stories attached to the A75 over decades. Truckers described seeing shadow figures crossing roads that vanished before impact. Others reported phantom headlights appearing behind them for miles without ever overtaking them. Some drivers claimed they saw old-fashioned trucks following them in mirrors, only for the vehicles to disappear when they changed lanes or checked again. Several described hearing knocks against trailer walls while driving through completely empty stretches of highway. One of the most disturbing reports came from a truck driver in the late 1950s who swerved violently after seeing a couple standing in the road ahead. He stopped, expecting bodies behind the trailer or crushed beneath the wheels. There was nothing there. The figures had vanished completely. That case became infamous enough that later paranormal investigators repeatedly revisited the route, trying to document similar sightings. But among truckers, the stories were rarely told like ghost stories. They were told like warnings. The important detail repeated over and over was the reaction afterward. Drivers who experienced these sightings often described overwhelming dread rather than shock. Some became physically ill. Some refused to drive the route again. Others quit night hauling entirely. A retired Scottish trucker interviewed years later described the feeling this way. "You'd think seeing something impossible would make you question reality. It doesn't. It makes you feel like reality questioned you first." The road itself became part of the fear, especially during fog. Drivers on the A75 repeatedly described moments where distance stopped behaving normally. Headlights seemed too close but never arrived. Shapes appeared far away and suddenly stood directly beside the cab. One trucker claimed he drove behind another articulated lorry for nearly 40 minutes without ever being able to overtake it despite maintaining higher speed. Then the vehicle simply disappeared into open road. No turnoff, no side road, no brake lights fading away. It was just gone. The most unsettling part of Moody's story came afterward. For weeks after the sighting, he reportedly had recurring nightmares involving the children he saw on the road. In the dreams, they stood in the rain facing his truck, while something much larger waited behind them in darkness. He later admitted the dreams became bad enough that he started avoiding mirrors inside the cab while driving at night. Then one evening at a truck stop, another driver approached him after overhearing him mention the A75. The man asked him a very specific question. "Did the little girl wave at you?" Moody apparently never spoke publicly again about the details after that conversation, because yes, she had. He just had not mentioned it to anyone before. That tiny detail spread among drivers afterward and became part of the fear surrounding the road. Some truckers began claiming that if the figures acknowledged you directly, especially the children, strange things followed afterward. Bad accidents, nightmares, mechanical failures in isolated stretches. Some swore they heard children laughing over dead CB frequencies while driving alone after midnight. Skeptics argued the obvious explanations: fatigue, fog distortion, road hypnosis, headlight reflection, sleep deprivation. And in many cases, those explanations probably fit. But what kept the stories alive was consistency. Drivers who had never met each other described the same things over decades on the same stretches of highway. Families crossing roads, phantom trucks, figures standing beneath overpasses, shapes seen in mirrors that vanished when looked at directly, voices over CB radios with no identifiable source. The road developed such a reputation that paranormal investigators and documentary crews eventually began exploring it themselves. Some reported equipment malfunctions and unexplained lights. Others captured nothing at all. Truckers continued telling the stories anyway, because highways at night already feel unreal. Long-haul driving creates a kind of isolation most people never experience. Hours of darkness, repetitive engine noise, no human contact except voices through radios. Your brain starts filling silence with patterns. Every roadside object looks briefly human. Every reflection becomes movement. Every set of headlights feels personal. And somewhere in the middle of all that, certain roads collect stories the way old buildings collect mold. The A75 became one of those roads. To this day, older British truckers still warn younger drivers about certain stretches after midnight, especially during rain or fog. Some refuse to stop on the shoulder, no matter what they see ahead. Others tell rookies never to acknowledge figures standing beside the road if there are no nearby vehicles. And one warning appears over and over in trucking forums and old conversations. If you see children walking on the A75 in the middle of the night, do not stop the truck. Because according to drivers who swear the stories are true, the worst encounters begin after you open the cab door. Bruce Mendenhall was the kind of truck driver other people forgot as soon as they saw him. He was older, heavy-set, married, and ordinary in the way long-haul drivers often become ordinary to strangers. He moved through truck stops, fuel islands, diners, interstate rest areas, and freight corridors without drawing attention. He drove a yellow tractor trailer. He knew where to park, where the cameras were, where women lingered near truck stops, and how quickly a driver could leave one state and be hundreds of miles away by morning. That ordinary appearance was what made him dangerous. In 2007, women began turning up dead around truck stops in Tennessee and Indiana. The victims were vulnerable women, many connected to prostitution or transient life around highway stops. That made the cases easier for the world to ignore at first. Their lives were complicated. They were not always reported missing immediately. Some had criminal records, some had unstable housing, some were last seen near truck stops where people come and go constantly and nobody remembers every face. Mendenhall understood that world. He understood that truck stops are strange places at night. Bright, loud, full of diesel engines and fluorescent lights, yet somehow anonymous. Drivers sleep behind curtains. People move between showers, fuel counters, fast food restaurants, parking rows, and idling rigs. A scream inside a cab can vanish beneath engine noise. A woman can climb into a truck and disappear behind a sleeper curtain while people walk past 10 feet away. The case that exposed him began in Nashville. On June 26, 2007, the body of 25-year-old Sarah Nicole Holbert was found near a truck stop. She had been shot. Detective Pat Postiglione of the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department began reviewing surveillance footage from the area. On video, he noticed a yellow truck. Later, while continuing the investigation, he saw a similar truck at another truck stop and acted on the connection. That decision became the break in the case. Mendenhall was arrested in Tennessee on July 12, 2007. When police searched his truck, the horror of the case changed. This was no longer just one murder. Inside the cab, investigators found blood, not a small spot. Blood in multiple places, including areas around the steering wheel and inside the truck. They found bloody clothing and personal effects linked to another missing woman, 31-year-old Karma Purpura from Indianapolis. She had disappeared after being seen at a Flying J truck stop off Interstate 465 in Indiana. Her phone, ATM card, and bloody clothing were found in Mendenhall's truck, and years later her remains were found in Kentucky. He was eventually convicted for her murder as well. Police cataloged hundreds of items from the truck: a rifle, knives, handcuffs, latex gloves, black tape, a nightstick, sex toys, cartridges, bloody clothing, personal items from women. DNA testing linked evidence in the truck to multiple women. Mendenhall was not just suspected in one killing. He became a suspect in a wider pattern of murders around truck stops and interstate corridors. One of the victims connected to him was Samantha Winters. Her body was found on June 6, 2007, in a trash can at a truck stop in Lebanon, Tennessee. She had been shot. Mendenhall was later convicted in her murder and sentenced to life. That detail is what makes the case feel so cold. A trash can at a truck stop, not a remote forest, not a hidden grave, a place where people fuel up, buy coffee, use bathrooms, and keep moving. Someone could have walked past the container without knowing a murdered woman was inside. Drivers could have been talking about routes, dispatchers, fuel prices, logbooks, and delivery times while a body sat nearby. That is the nightmare of truck stop killings. They happen in public places that still feel private because nobody belongs there for long. Mendenhall's arrest opened the possibility that he had killed more than the women he was convicted of murdering. He was suspected in other cases across several states, including women found near truck stops or interstate areas. Authorities examined possible links to deaths in Tennessee, Indiana, Alabama, Georgia, and other places. Not every suspected connection resulted in charges, and some cases were later attributed to other killers. But the amount of evidence in his truck made investigators believe they were looking at a man who had used long-haul trucking as cover for repeated violence. In January 2025, Mendenhall was convicted of the murder of Karma Purpura, making it his third murder conviction. Prosecutors described his crimes as part of a chilling murder spree targeting truck stops, and he was later sentenced to another 65 years for that Indiana murder. What makes his story especially frightening is how close he came to remaining invisible. He was not caught because he confessed to everything. He was not caught because one perfect witness saw everything. He was caught because a detective noticed a truck in surveillance footage, a truck that looked familiar, a truck that should have blended into hundreds of other trucks. That is the detail that stays with drivers. At a truck stop, every rig looks like part of the scenery. Trailers line up in rows, refrigeration units hum, exhaust hangs in the air, people sleep behind curtains. Drivers climb down, stretch, fuel, smoke, eat, shower, and climb back in. Nobody wants to stare too long at another driver's cab. Nobody wants trouble. Everyone is tired. Mendenhall used that environment. A woman could approach the truck. A door could close. The truck could leave. By the time anybody wondered where she went, the driver might already be on the interstate, crossing county lines, then state lines, then disappearing into the larger machinery of freight movement. That is why cases like his became central to a much larger fear inside law enforcement. The FBI later developed the Highway Serial Killings Initiative to study murders and disappearances connected to highways, truck stops, motels, and rest areas. Investigators have looked at hundreds of victims found near highways and hundreds of possible suspects, with long-haul trucking appearing in a disproportionate number of cases because the job provides mobility, privacy, and jurisdictional confusion. Most truckers are just working people doing brutal hours. That is exactly why killers like Mendenhall are so terrifying. They hide inside an honest profession. They use the same roads, the same fuel pumps, the same parking lots, the same CB chatter, the same tired face at the counter buying coffee at 3 in the morning. A driver parked beside him might never know what was inside the cab. A woman walking past might not know she had entered the last safe space before being seen by him. A clerk might sell him coffee after midnight and forget him 5 minutes later, and somewhere behind the sleeper curtain, evidence was waiting. Blood, clothing, IDs, tools. The remains of lives that had crossed his path at the wrong truck stop, on the wrong night, beside the wrong yellow truck. That is the real horror of Bruce Mendenhall. Not that he looked like a monster, that he did not.